Good morning. My name is Allison Pelkes, and I serve as the Multi-Faith Coordinator for the Truett Center for Religious and Spiritual Life at Elon. It is my pleasure to put together this Newman Lumen series. Last semester, we heard from numerous stories from faculty, staff, and students at Elon about our theme, Bridging to Hope. The theme asks speakers and our community to ponder together the roots of hope and the vision it invites us to pursue. If hope is an action word, then what does it look like in our lives, and how does it motivate and keep us focused and centered? What is its root and character? When did we opt for hope, and how has that led us to new life now? What have been the costs and burdens of hope? And what does the future of hope look like from our personal or institutional contexts? Before I introduce our speaker, I want to personally invite you to our annual Ripple Conference. Ripple is a student-led interfaith conference typically held on Elon's campus, but this year we are completely virtual and are welcoming folks from across the nation into our space around the theme Intersectional Interfaith. Our keynote speaker, activist and historian Blair Imani, is not one to miss, and so I invite you to check out details at rippleconference.org. The conference will be held on the evening of Friday, February 19th and Saturday, the 20th of February. All are welcome. This morning, however, we hear from Dr. Jennifer Carroll. Dr. Carroll is an assistant professor of anthropology at Elon. She is a medical anthropologist, research scientist, and subject matter expert on substance abuse and public health interventions to prevent overdose. Along with her PhD in anthropology, she holds a master's in public health from the University of Washington. Dr. Carroll was highly recommended by a couple of her students to speak at Newman Lumen, and I'm thrilled to pass the mic to her now.
Good morning. I am excited to have this opportunity to gather with you, even though it is an unconventional and strange sort of gathering. And in fact, an unconventional and strange sort of gathering is what I wanted to talk to you about today. When I was told that this year's theme was Bridging to Hope, I immediately thought of this amazing article I read a few years ago. Not hard, because almost everything makes me think of this amazing article that I read that was called How a Phone Glitch Sparked a Teenage Riot. So this was a Medium post that was published in December 2018 by journalist Sean Raviv, who details the rapid descent of Swedish youth culture in the early 1980s from this well-organized utopia that literally sanctioned social inclusion through the establishment of formal spaces and institutions to meet the need of any conceivable demographic, to some chaotic cesspool of disorganized and unpredictable behaviors like making friends outside of school or meeting up in public parks to hang out, right? And so the driver of this wave of wild abandon was a new craze that had all of Sweden's young people sucked in. Many reported that their kids would come home from school and spend hours and hours tied up in this thing. One person interviewed by Raviv reported that it was, quote, like a drug. This thing that I am talking about, right, the root of all Scandinavian social ills in the 1980s apparently, was the rotary telephone. So according to Raviv's reporting, all of Sweden's phone lines were connected in the early 1980s by a state-run telecommunications company called Televerket. This was the era of landlines, so relocating residences meant not only getting a new address, but a new phone number as well. As a courtesy to customers, Televerket implemented a system that kept deliberately disconnected numbers out of use for several months after a customer moved. And rather than assigning the number to a new customer right away, the old number would be routed to a central operating system where callers would receive a recorded message about the disconnection, followed by 4 beeps, followed by a long stretch of silence, after which the message would automatically repeat. So sometime around 1980 or 1981, teenagers, made the fortuitous discovery that if 2 people called a recently disconnected line at the same time, they could hear each other through those long gaps of silence between the recorded messages. In fact, several, sometimes dozens of people could be accommodated and talk to each other on the unassigned line at the same time. This conference calling ability was a result of a glitch in the system. This was not an intended use case for these unassigned lines. People were meant to call, hear the message, realize their error, and hang up. And it was fortuitous for the discoverers of this glitch because all calls at that time were charged to customers by the minute. But the unassigned numbers, when called, because they were made in error, were free. So young people could dial up these unassigned lines and talk to folks from all over Sweden for hours at a time. Some people even had handles or nicknames that they used to identify one another on these lines, and it became this heavily trafficked telephone-based social network. Users called it the Hetjelinjen, the hotline. Right? So unassigned numbers for the hotline were traded among youth in and around Stockholm in the way that darknet URLs are today. High schoolers kept updated written lists of which lines were active and which had been reassigned, and a veritable whisper network of teenagers kept this information in circulation among their peers. Also, like the darknet, this hotline was sometimes used for selling contraband of various kinds, but mostly it functioned as a social network, connecting small town kids to peers in other regions, giving city kids a social outlet that wasn't overly structured or chaperoned, and some hotline users formed groups or clubs who met regularly, always using the same numbers to reconnect with each other and leading, like many of the IRC chat rooms of the early internet, to deep and meaningful friendships between numerous people who had never actually met in real life. But we haven't reached the chaotic dystopia part yet. That came to a head in September 1982 when a large number of hotline users created a plan to come together on a Friday night in a Stockholm park to hang out in real life. The term meetup had not yet been coined. In fact, the very idea of a meetup is only conceivable in a world where reliable, mass, real-time social interaction can take place remotely, or a social network. Hotline users had literally just invented that part of the equation. So any hope that adults in the area would have a framework for making sense of why thousands of teenagers were gathering in a park at sunset would be quite misplaced. So the voting age residents of Stockholm did what all adults do when young people come together in large numbers to participate in a novel activity that they don't understand. They called the police. So according to Raviv, more than 50 officers with dogs and batons and riot gear showed up at the park to try to figure out what the devil was going on and how they were going to put a stop to it. Ola Lindgren, one of the teenagers present at the park that night, remembered, quote, "The police were a bit scared. They hadn't seen anything like it before. Officers began working the crowd back towards the edge of the park, hoping to clear the area, and the teenagers, likely aware that they outnumbered the police 20-1, began jeering from their perches atop walls and tree branches, throwing pebbles or cans, forcing some officers to take cover behind parked vehicles nearby, doing their part to escalate the situation. Police in Stockholm fought back aggressively, and by the end of the night, 10 hotline participants had been arrested and 4 officers suffered mild injuries. The next day, newspaper headlines referred to the incident as the Hettelinjen Upploppet, or the Hotline Riot. So why do I tell this story when the theme of this year's Newman Lumen talk is bridging hope? Well, A, I love this story and I love telling it, but B, because I think this story illustrates a few things that I've learned that are fundamentally true. The first is this: the only happiness that you can rely on is the happiness that you make for yourself. You may choose to place your happiness in things that lie outside of yourself, like in status or relationships, achievements, wealth, but happiness does not naturally adhere to external conditions. It can fade quickly when attached to slippery, ephemeral things, and it can burn hot and bright even in their absence. In this pandemic year, for a lot of us, the biggest challenge we face is not the social isolation that defines our everyday, but rather it's been the copious amount of time that we've been forced to spend with ourselves. Some of you may have gone into the pandemic having already done a lot of work to be comfortable with who you are and how you think and what you feel, and that's awesome. But our society does very little to encourage that kind of introspection. And most of us, especially those of us who are truly living alone, found ourselves trapped in our apartments with the most irritating person imaginable: ourselves. And lacking access to our usual strategies for distracting ourselves from ourselves and our thoughts and our feelings, we were forced to coexist with them in ways that we weren't at all used to. So for me, this manifested in a few ways. I'm a scholar. My spiritual lifeblood and my professional bread and butter is in the written word. In many ways, I read and write for a living. In a typical year, in addition to the copious essays and journal articles that I consume, I tend to read 50 to 60 books of various kinds cover to cover. This year, it's been less than 10. And most of those were audiobooks, not the ink and paper versions that are typical of my own reading practice. Because if I didn't have the words coming at me in a mechanical and automated way, I couldn't read. My brain was on fire, bouncing a million directions, working so hard in the quiet to distract itself from itself that I was distracting myself from the distractions from myself. And while I would be lying if I said I'd gotten past this, I still struggle with it a lot. In fact, I have gotten better. I do feel somehow in these imperceptible ways I've become more grounded in the last year. Not a ton, but enough to notice. By grounded, I suppose I mean that I have become familiar to myself in ways that I haven't before. The weird cycles that my brain goes through every day, the roller coaster of emotions that I am, it turns out, constantly experiencing, something I only noticed once I was forced to slow down enough to pay attention to it, no longer feels so disorienting and bad. Now that I know its patterns, it feels more like a rhythm. It feels familiar. It feels like me. And suddenly, I'm better able to exist with me. Sometimes I even like me, and even though this was a me I didn't really take the time to recognize before now. I take those Swedish kids in the park in 1980s as a role model in this regard. German author Magnus Enzensberger wrote about the Hotline riot a few years later in 1987, right after it happened. Reflecting on the gathering of youth in the Stockholm Park, he observed, quote, "No one knew where the youth had come from or what they wanted. They didn't want to demonstrate for or against anything. They were simply there." They were simply there. No goals, no agenda, no greater purpose than existing and enjoying themselves while doing it. This year, I have learned that being able to do that is really great, right? I've found a new way to make a new kind of happiness that is no one's but my own. Doing kind of mediocre job, but I'm doing it. Second, that happiness is multiplied when we create space in which we, with our own hand-forged happiness and sense of self, can coexist as ourselves together. Again, these Swedish kids come bearing wisdom beyond their years. They were already connected. They were already pursuing new things and carving out new worlds where they could join one another in simply being there for themselves, right? But in a sense, they said, hey, let's take this hotline, let's take this thing that we're doing together and do it, but together. Right? The coming together in a park felt like this natural instinct to commune, and that sense of connectedness that they shared came not only from common experience, but also common strategy for breaking through that social isolation to reach each other. It came from the genuineness, the confidence, the ease and joy that each individual brought with them. They came fully prepared to be together because they came fully as themselves. Now, obviously, my advice to you is not to gather en masse during a pandemic. That is an extremely bad idea and clearly not an activity rooted in the practice of holding space for each other. Being in someone else's air right now, ironically, is the opposite of affording that person the ability to fully exist in very real ways. But we find other ways to do the thing that we're doing together, but together. For me, the place where I found these fleeting but deeply important spaces of coexistence with my closest friends has been private chats on Zoom calls. It seems like a small, goofy example, but for me it's been a really powerful one. We'll all be online for a talk or a professional meeting or a webinar, and we're all there together. But while we're listening to the discussant ask questions or the meeting chair run over the minutes from the previous call, we are blowing up the chat box with a million private messages talking to each other about anything and everything. And even though I am perfectly capable of just picking up the phone and talking to people when I miss them, those Zoom chats are where we connect. That is where I have learned about new jobs and foster puppies, where I've talked politics and swapped pictures of kids and shared waffle recipes. And the Zoom chat is the place where my network comes together so that we can do the thing that we're doing together, but together. It's not just the venue where we gather. That's the webinar. Instead, it's the space where we hold space. I'm sure many of you have found similar habits and unearthed creative avenues for that kind of connection. And in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a silly way to connect, but it's still deeply valuable. So I have hope that even in these weird times, we're still capable of holding space for each other by showing up in unexpected places as our whole selves. Third, we face no bigger obstacle and no greater barrier to our capacity to hold that space and to be our truest, happiest selves with each other than our lack of imagination. There's a famous quote by Abraham Maslow, which you've probably heard a dozen times already. "I suppose it is tempting," he said, "if you are holding a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail." This is probably one of the most widely misunderstood quotes in our cultural vernacular. Quite likely, you were taught that this aphorism is a cautionary tale about the failure to recognize when we see the world through blinders, as though having a hammer in our hand brainwashes us into thinking that nails are the only thing that exist in the world, that we assume all things, all problems, all people are nails, and that the solution is to take a hammer to them and make the nails do what nails are supposed to do. This, however, is the opposite of what Maslow is trying to say. If you read that quote in its original context, it becomes clear that this statement is part of a larger argument about how we lack the imagination to understand our tools differently. That when holding a hammer, we treat problems as though they are nails, not because we're hallucinating phantom nails out there in the world, but because whatever we perceive the problem to be, we can't imagine any use for the hammer other than pounding things in. Maslow's point is that we grossly underestimate the vast and radical potential of the hammer. So Swedish kids imagined the hammer differently. They found a tool that was designed for a specific, narrow purpose, namely for informing the caller that a line had been disconnected, and discovered a world of possibilities within that tool, which they only discovered by using that tool differently than it was intended, namely by staying on the line. So suddenly, a tool designed for the express purpose of making people hang up become widely used in ways never conceived by its designers. Now, obviously, if a tool is designed to be great at one thing, it may be mediocre when used as something else, right? So to the kids in the hotline, for example, they had to listen to a recorded message every minute or so, followed by a series of beeps for literally ever, as long as they were on the line. That had to be profoundly irritating. It was an enormous weakness that characterized the use of these open lines as a tool for connection. Yet, the power of that connection didn't seem at all abated by that. Right? If anything, it became part of the shared experience and the culture of the hotline. It was an odd feature that participants could share and make their own. It was secret knowledge that they possessed about a weird and wonderful space that they had forged for themselves. That had to feel really cool. And here's the other thing. Even though they weren't doing anything bad by talking on these open lines, they were doing something unexpected. And for that reason, social pressures mounted to tell them that this not bad thing they were doing wasn't good. Recall what Enzensberger wrote about it. Quote, "No one knew where the youth had come from or what they wanted. They didn't want to demonstrate for or against anything. They were simply there." And that fundamentally was the problem. Eisenberger wrote, "Their crime was simply that they had not called upon any of the responsible institutions available for this purpose. If they had applied to the appropriate office with a request to organize a meeting place for aimless, weakly motivated, anomic young people, they would have been met with subsidies instead of police truncheons. Crowds of social workers, youth workers, and community art workers would have descended upon them to help them achieve socially desirable forms of communication." So like all fine bricoleurs of the world, hotline users were picking up the tools placed before them to meet the needs that they perceived at the time. But in a society that bureaucratically orchestrated its own forms of social cohesion, creating community through unsanctioned channels became, by its very nature, an act of social rebellion. Everyone agreed that making new connections was marvelous, but different generations of Swedes clearly disagreed on whether the means or the ends of these social building projects was of primary importance. So throughout your life, but especially during this pandemic year, you will never lack for people to tell you how you should be moving through the world, what channels you should be accessing to make connections, what spaces you're sanctioned to move in, live in, and be in. I want to challenge you and celebrate you. Same, for the ways in which you are going to, and have already made the world your own, in which you have found tools and channels and accidents and glitches and all of the empty spaces between the walls that are presented to us as sacrosanct, and lived there with your whole selves together. Rest assured, you will be told that these not bad things you are doing are not good. But so long as you are safe, so long as you are somehow together, so long as you are your whole selves, creating space for everyone, keep doing it. And when the old guard starts clutching their pearls, trying to shunt you back into the socially approved ways of being who you are, you'll know you're doing something right. You'll be manifesting the vast and radical potential of the hammer. And in this pandemic year, every moment I get to do that, and every moment I see you do that, is what brings me hope.